Masechet Ketubot Daf Kof Gimel. The Mishnah mentioned the case where a man marries a woman and she has a daughter already, and he agrees to feed the daughter for 5 years. They get divorced, and she makes the same deal with the second husband. So in that case, Lo Yamru Shnehem, both husbands can't come together and say, "Listen, we'll share the burden. I'll pay half, he'll pay half, and we together will support and feed the stepdaughter." No, each one independently agreed, and so even though they're not going to both give actual food, because how much can one person eat? But one of them will give food, and one of them will have to give money equivalent of what she would eat. All right, we're going to use this case to attempt a proof at a similar case. A man owned a millstone, and the owner of the millstone rented it out to his friend, so his friend could make tehine, or to grind things. The word tehine means that because it comes from ground sesame seeds. So he rents it out for use, and he would get paid. The idea is that the renter would not pay in cash, but rather would pay with labor and would grind some grain for the owner of the mill. And so that was a fair deal. Here, you get to use my mill for 10 hours, and for a couple of those hours, you'll grind my grains. And that way, it's an even exchange. But the owner of the mill got rich, and he was able to purchase a new, bigger mill and a donkey that could pull this nice big mill. And so now it was easy for him to grind his own grain with his donkey, and so he didn't need the renter to do the labor for him. So now the owner of the mill wants to change the details of their deal in the middle of the period that they agreed to. So the owner of the millstone says to the renter, "Until now, you were grinding for me, right? I was grinding my wheat with you, and you were paying me through that labor. But now I don't need your services anymore. So now pay me rent." But the renter said, "No, I don't have extra cash to just give you. This was a good deal for me because I don't have extra cash. I have extra time, so I don't mind doing the milling by hand for you. So I'll continue paying you as we agreed, with labor, but not with money." So this is the disagreement, and they came to Ravina to decide. Savar Ravina lememad, Hainu matnitin lo yomiru shenehem are anu zanin ota ke'echad ele echad zana ve'echad noten la deme mezonot. So Ravina says, I think even though the Mishnah doesn't talk about this exact case, I'm going to make an analogy to our Mishnah, where the circumstances have changed in this case. Both of them obligated themselves to pay food, actual food, to the stepdaughter, but now that things changed, they both have to give her something, but one can give her food and the other one has to pay her cash. And therefore, so too here, the circumstances have changed, and now the owner of the mill already has a means to do his labor, to grind his wheat, and he doesn't need that labor anymore, but he does want cash. So he thought that, yes, the renter will from now on have to pay cash. That's what Avina was thinking. Amar le Rav Avira, midame, but Rav Avira said to him, "Wait, these cases are not the same. Hatam had keresait letarte keresata letla." With the stepdaughter, she has one stomach. Does she have two stomachs? How much can one person eat? So it makes sense that you're not going to give her twice the amount of food. So one of the husbands will have to give her cash. So there the circumstances change. Whereas here the renter can say to the owner of the mill, "Listen, I want to continue grinding for you, and you have no loss because you can use your nice big mill and the donkey to grind and sell, or grind and store for later. So you can still use yours and get profit. So you'll get cash from doing that, and I will continue the same thing." And so, in other words, a person can't eat twice as much, but a person in their business can benefit from the twice as much power to grind, because they can make money from that. And so the renter is different. So we cannot learn from our Mishnah to the case of the renter. The renter can still give labor. However, we only say that the renter can continue doing labor if he has no other grinding to do on that millstone. In other words, he's just gonna, if he doesn't do the grinding for the owner of the millstone, then he's just gonna be doing nothing with it, and he has no other customers, for example, or other wheat that he needs to grind, that he could use it and be busy with the mill anyway. So then he can demand from the owner to keep the same status and listen, I have no other use for this. I grind my own mill. I grind my own wheat for 8 hours. The other 2 hours, I have nothing else to grind. I have no other customers. And so I'm depending on using it for that time to grind your wheat, Mr. Owner, and that's how I pay. In that case, they can continue the same deal. However, if the renter does have other grinding that he can do with the grindstone, he can offer his services to other people, then they will pay money for the rental. Then we say you have to pay the rent, because this is otherwise it's called midat sedom. Midat sedom is if if you can benefit from something that I have and I lose nothing from it, I have a half a sandwich, I'm not eating anyway, I'm about to throw it out, and you say, hey, can I have it? I said, well, I'm going to make you pay for it. Well, I wasn't, I was throwing it out anyway, so I wasn't losing, and now I'm going to make you pay for it. That's a midah of sedom. And so this guy, the renter, he's not losing out if he has other customers, and he can go and use it profitably during that time. So if the renter's not losing out and he can get cash and pay cash, then he must do that. Otherwise that's midat sedom. If he does not have other customers, does not have other things to grind, and he's going to lose out, then we say you can continue paying in labor, and the owner of the mill has to agree to that. Okay, next Mishnah. Almana she'amra efshi lazuz mi bet ba'ali en hayrushin yecholin lomar la lechi lebet avich v'anu zanin otach. So part of the stipulation of a ketubah is that after the husband dies, the estate has to take care of the widow, and that includes not only food but also a place to live. And a place to live is not any random place. The widow can say, I don't want to leave my husband's home, the place that we were living together this whole time, even though that home is going to be inherited by the sons. Nevertheless, the sons have to allow for their be either mother or stepmother, to whoever the widow is, to remain in the house. And they cannot say, go to your father's house and we will sustain you there. We'll send the food over there. We'll send you what you need there, but we're kicking you out of the house that you lived in. No, they don't do that. They don't have a right to do that. Rather, they have to sustain her, and they have to give her living quarters befitting her dignity within the house. They have to give her her own private area that is accordance with what she would expect and what she's used to. Amra, ifshi lazuz mi bet Abba, yocholinu shenomar la, im at eslenu yesh lach mezonot, v'im en at eslenu en lach mezonot. If she says, I want to go to my father's house, and I want to stay in my father's house, she doesn't want to remain in the house that she was living in with her husband, but she wants to go back to where she grew up. Then she loses her rights to sustenance. The heirs can tell her, if you are living here in our house, the house of our father, where you also lived, then we'll give you sustenance, right? Because we put out dinner every night anyway. And so you'll join us here, and so that's easy for us. But if you're not with us, then we do not have an obligation to sustain you. And they do have a right to say that. Unless she has a good reason. If she says, I'm young and you're also young, for example, the father had children from one wife and then got divorced, and then he married a younger woman. So it could be that this stepmother is relatively young, and maybe these sons are also single and young, and so it would be inappropriate for them to be living together. In that case, she has a right to say, I'm going and living in my father's house, and they do have to sustain her there. All right. Gemara, Tenor Banan. משתמשת במדור כדרך שמשתמשת בחיי בעלה. That is elaborating on the Mishnah that says when it says that the widow has a right to remain in the house of her husband, it means that she can also use it in the same way that she used it in her during her lifetime. They can't kick her out and put her in the basement. And she has use of the slaves and maidservants in the house as she did when her husband was alive. She can use the pillows and sheets the same way she did when her husband was alive. The heirs can't tell her, well, no, now you have to, use the cheap sheets. She uses the fancy gold and silverware as she did when her husband was alive. Because that's what it says, a stipulation in the Ketubot, that you will reside in my house, be sustained from my property all the days that you live as a widow. So that means sustained in a regular, normal way that she was used to when he was alive. There is an exception where the heirs can kick her out. Since it says you can live in my house, it doesn't say you can live in my hut. So if the residence is just a small hut, just a one bedroom studio apartment, and there's not going to be enough room for the heirs and the widow to all be there together. It's too small. Then the heirs can say, sorry, this is too small and you cannot live here. They do have a right to say that. If the heirs try to sell the home of their father where where the widow lives, that sale is invalid. They do not have a right to sell it. The widow has rights to it. She has a lien on that property, and that's why she gets to live there. Question. Why is his case different from this other statement of Rabbi Yochanan, where it's talking about orphans who went and sold, they quickly sold their inheritance, and even though there are not enough money to go around. We're talking about a case where there are boys and girls. So in that case, although boys inherit, the girls get first rights to be sustained by the property, and so therefore, if there's insufficient funds to take care of both, then only the girls will get the money. And in this case, however, if the orphans go and quickly sell the property of their father before the Bet Din gets a chance to extract it from them and give it to the girls, that sale is valid. So why? How come when the orphans sell the land, before the widow gets a chance to take it, the sale is invalid, but when the orphans sell it before their sisters the daughters of the deceased get a chance to take it, it is valid. What's the difference? And the answer is hatam la mishtabedeh la mechayim, hacha mishtabedeh la mechayim. In the case of the sons and daughters, orphans, the daughters do not have a lien on the property from when they are alive. It's only after the father dies, then it goes as an inheritance to the sons, and the sons have to give it to the daughters. So in the meantime, it does in fact go to the sons. There's no lien on it. So at that point, before it's transferred, if the sons sell it, it's a valid sale. Whereas in this case, with the wife, the widow has a lien on her husband's property while they are alive, while the husband is alive. And therefore, when he dies, she already has a lien, and if they try to sell it, the sale is invalid. That makes sense. Abaye says we have a tradition that if the home of a widow falls, then the heirs do not have a responsibility to rebuild it. Right? They do have a responsibility to allow her to live in that home, but if it falls, they don't have to spend money and rebuild it. Abaye said this as a tradition, and we have a braita as well. Again, same thing. They don't have to build it. Afilu hi omeret hanichuni ve'ebnenu misheli and shom'in la. Furthermore, if she says, leave it there, I'll rebuild it from my own funds, we don't listen to her. After all, the land and the building material, the bricks that were used and wood, whatever, that fell down, they wouldn't throw it out. They would reuse those same building materials. So even if she says, listen, leave everything there, I'll pay for the rebuilding, and I want to continue living there. They don't have to allow her. She has a right to live in the home of her husband, but if there's no home there, then that's it. The heirs can take it. Question. Let's say it didn't fall down yet, but it was kind of shaky, and the widow goes and repairs it. It would have fallen down had she not repaired it, but she repaired it. So can she stay, or do we say no? It was gonna fall down. It would have been in ruins, and then the heirs could have taken it. We leave that question standing. Well, kind of like this home is also still standing, just barely. All right, Amra if she says, I don't want to move from my father's house. I want to live with my father and the house that I grew up in. In that case, the heirs do not have to give her food. Question. Oh, why? Let her live there, and they should give her support, just like if she was living in their husband's house. Like, what's the difference? Why not send the food to her father's house? The reason is, as we're going to see in this following statement, so this supports the statement of Rav Huna, that there's blessing in the house in its abundance. When there's a lot of people living in a house, then their blessing comes to the house. Right? Somehow, if you have 10 people living in the house, the expenses get absorbed. It doesn't cost 10 times as much of this as if there's one person in the house. You buy things in bulk, everybody shares, and it works out. So the point here is that if the widow is living in the house with the heirs, they can more easily take care of her. It's just one more person in the house, so the expenses are only a little bit more. Whereas if they're going to have to go and send food and other items that she needs there, right, then it's going to cost a lot more. So it does make a difference to them. Okay, question. So how about if they make a deal and she lives in her father's house and they will send her the amount that it would cost them had she stayed, right? They can estimate. Listen, we have 9 people living in the house. For you, the widow, they could tell her to live in the house would just be a 10th person. How much more would that be in our expenses? It wouldn't be, it would only be a few percent more. Instead of having to pay $100 a day, we would really only have to pay $50 a day to sustain you if you were here. If so, then they can send that $50 to her in her father's house. So how about that? Because now the orphans aren't losing anything. And the answer is, yes, indeed they could. They can make that deal. And that would be within the rights of both parties. Amar Rav Huna, Lashon Chachamim beracha, Lashon Chachamim osher, Lashon Chachamim marper. Rav Huna reflects on the way the sages teach things, that when they want to teach a halacha, they don't simply teach the halacha, they also give good advice. They say things about blessings, about wealth, and about healing. How so? Beracha hadamaran. Beracha, we just said over here, even though it was a technical halacha about how much expenses are when someone's living, if you're taking care of them in your own home as opposed to when they're going somewhere else. Nevertheless, they say they don't just say it in a technical way, they say it as such a nice thing, right? There's beracha with lots of people in the house. So that's what we already said. Now, the next one, Osher Ditnan, this is a Mishnah in Baba Batra, Mocher Perot Lachavero, Mashach velo madad kana. If I'm buying produce from you, if I pull the produce, or if I actually move it, then the buyer, that's an active acquisition by pulling it. Even if I didn't measure it out, still, it's mine and I can't renege on the deal. Madad velo mashach lo kana. But if it was weighed, usually it's the seller that does the weighing. You have to imagine like an old Western grocery store where there's the counter and the seller is doing the weighing behind the counter there. And so if the seller weighs everything out, but the buyer did not pull it, did not yet pick it up, then it's not, the sale did not go through. So this could be annoying for the seller because the seller can do all this work, measure everything out, prepare everything, and the buyer says, I changed my mind, I don't want it. And the seller has no recourse. So, but if the seller is smart, he can rent out that area, right? The area on the counter where they're putting everything aside. So, okay, here, this is yours, and put it in that area so the buyer does acquire it, although he's not pulling it. He acquires it because it's in his space, because he rented it out, right? So the seller said, listen, here's your space, I'm renting it to you. Anything I put down there, you already own, and therefore you can't renege. So again, this is a halacha, but it teaches also good advice, not just that, okay, no lo kana. It tells the seller what to do so he can be rich. Marpeh, ditanan lo yalaos, adam chitin v'yanech al gabe makato b'pesach mepnei shemahamisot. Mishnah in Pesachim says you should not chew wheat and put it on a wound on Pesach. I guess this was if on their foot, if they had a wound, they could put some wheat on it, and that would be beneficial. But that's fine to do all year round, but not on Pesach. A wound, I guess it could be anywhere. This would be like a Band-Aid. Instead of putting this dough item instead of a Band-Aid. You could do that all year round, but don't do that on Pesach, because if you leave this dough there, it's going to become chametz, and it's dough, it's edible. So therefore, find something else to do on Pesach. So you see how the rabbis also give you advice about how to follow halacha and also have healing. Teno Rabbanan. Peshat petirato shel Rabbi amar lebanai ani sarich. Okay, now we have a very important story about the death of Rabbi Yeudah Nasi. When he was dying on his deathbed, he said, I need my sons here. Call them in. He told them some directives. Number one, I want you to be careful to honor your mother. The Gemara is going to ask, why does he have to say that? Doesn't everybody have to honor their mother? And second, I want my lamp should be lit where I usually like it. I want the table to be set as it usually is when I'm there. I want my table setting there. I want my bed to be arranged, to be made in its place. Yosef, Haifani, Shimon, Efrati, Hem Shemeshuni Behayai, Hem Yeshameshuni Bemoti. And furthermore, these two gentlemen, Yosef and Shimon, they served me while I was alive, and I want them to serve me after I die, which sounds like he wants them to be the ones that will arrange for his burial. Now we're going to analyze each statement. Hold on, Torah already says you have to honor your father and your mother. Why would you have to tell them to follow a simple law in the Torah? Answer is Eshet Av Havai. No, that was their father's wife. It was their stepmother. Even though he said Immechem, it was actually stepmother. And so that's why he said, even though she's not your biological mother, nevertheless, I want you to honor her. Hold on, that still doesn't answer the question. Eshet Av Nami Doraita Detanya. Kabed et abicha ve'et imecha. Et abicha zo eshet abicha ve'et imecha zo ba'alat imecha. Vav yetera lebot et achicha hagadol. Honoring a stepmother is also a Doraita law, since it has the extra word et, comes to include a stepmother, and the et imecha comes to include a stepfather. It's interesting that it calls it a Doraita, even though we're learning it from a derasha. The vav of ve et imecha comes to include one's older brother, who can be in a family like a father figure. So the Rabbi wouldn't have to tell his sons that either. They would know that they would know this derasha and know that this is already a law that's commanded in the Torah, that they have to honor their stepmother. So this is only true that a person has to honor their stepmother when their father is alive. It's kind of indirect. It's a way of showing honor to the father by showing honor to the father's wife. But after the father dies, then there's no mitzvah d'oraita anymore to give special honor to the stepmother. And that's what Rabbi Yeudah Nasi said. Listen, even after I die, although there's no technical mitzvah, I want you to afford her same honor as you have done. Why does he want his lamp and his table and his bed all set? Because every Shabbat Eve, every Friday night, the Yeudah Nasi is going to come in a state of his soul, a ghost-like spirit is going to come and visit the house, and he wants everything there and set up as usual so he can feel at home. Okay. Hahu be'shimsha atai shababta kakarya ababa. So it happened to be that one Shabbat evening, a neighbor came, and she called and knocked on the door for whatever reason. Amra ammete shetiku terbiatev. The maidservant says, "Be quiet. Rabbi Yeudah is sitting here. Don't disturb him." Now the neighbor knew that Yeudah Nasi died, and so now the maidservant is revealing this fact that he's coming and visiting as just his soul. Kevan de Shama Rabbi Yeudah Nasi heard the maidservant reveal this. Shub lo ata, he never came back to the house again. Shelo lo silaz al tzadikim harishonim, in order not to cast aspersions on earlier righteous people. If people hear this, wow, Rabbi Yeudah Nasi is so great, he was able to come home and visit every Friday night after his death. Well, is that because he's so great? What about that other rabbi? He was also great, but does he go visit? No, he doesn't get to visit his family. That guy doesn't get to visit his family after he died. And so they're going to belittle the other sages who don't have this benefit. And so he said he stopped coming so that people won't put him above the other sages. All right, interesting story. Yosef Hanefi, Chefani, Shimon Efrati, Hem Shemishuni B'chayev, Hem Shemishuni B'moti, when he said that these two people should serve him after in his death, like they did in his life. They thought that they were talking, Yeudah was talking about this world, that these two people would attend to his death and bury him, which is an honor. But while the Yeudah Nasi is on his deathbed, these two people, Yosef and Shimon, they themselves died before Rabbi Yeudah Nasi. And they said that we understood, he doesn't mean in this world. It says they will serve him in the next world. They served him in this world. And next world, he also wants his attendants to take care of him there. So they died so they could accompany him, Rabbi Yeudah Nasi, to the next world. How come he said it in this way? That was kind of cryptic because he didn't want people to think that there was something wrong with these two people, Yosef and Shimon, and the only reason they deserve death on their own, but the only reason they stayed alive is for the merit of Rabbi that benefited them. He didn't want people to think that, so that's why he explained that no, they served me in their life and did such a good job, and they're righteous, but I need them. I want them to serve me after I die. And so he explained that no one should think that there's anything wrong with them, that they died at this time. Okay, Amar lahem Chachmei Yisrael ani sarich. Okay, after Rabbi Yeudah Nasi gave his last will to his sons, he called in the sages. He had something to say to them. Nichnesu eslo Chachmei Yisrael. Amar lahem al tispeduni ba'ayarot. Number one, I don't want eulogies in small towns. We'll explain why. Ve'hoshibu yeshiva la'achar sheloshim yom. And I want you to reconvene study sessions after 30 days. In other words, all the students are going to stop learning to mourn him for 30 days. After 30 days, then go back. Shimon beni Chacham, Gamliel beni Nasi, Hanina bar Chama, Yeshe barosh. He says, I want my son Shimon to be the Chacham, but I want Gamliel to be the Nasi. The Nasi is the highest position. It's a high political and religious position. It's the person who is in charge of the whole community, liaison to the Roman government, and so Gamliel is going to be the Nasi, and Shimon is going to be the secondary, will be Chacham, and Hanina bar Chama will be the head of the yeshiva. Okay, let's analyze what he said. How come he didn't want to get buried and be eulogized in small towns? But so they thought he didn't want people to be troubled that they would have to go into the small towns. If they live in little villages and farms, then everybody would have to stop work and go into the town. So he was being humble and saying, no, don't bother people to come into the small towns. That's what they thought. But then they saw what actually happened is, because they were not eulogizing in the small towns, everyone from the villages and the small towns came to the large cities, and they were all eulogizing him in the large cities. Then they understood it was actually because of the honor that was due to him. If people had stayed in the small towns, then they wouldn't have had the big gatherings in the big towns. So when you have a lot of people, everyone coming from all over into the big towns, that's a much more honorable and fitting way to eulogize the Nasi of the generation. Hoshibu yeshiva lachar shirshim yom. When he said, go back to the study sessions after 30 days, why? Why did he limit it? Moshe Rabbeinu says, I'm not greater than Moshe. Tichtiv vayibku bnei Yisrael Moshe b'arbot ma'av sheloshim yom. They cried for Moshe 30 days. Telatin yom min seftei b'mama v'lelya, which means 30 days they eulogized Moshe day and night. Mikan ve'elach seftu b'mama v'gaseh b'lelya, or seftu b'lelya v'gaseh b'mama, ad seftei terasar yadche shata. So 30 days, day and night, but from then on, they would either eulogize during the day and study Torah at night, or they would eulogize at night and study Torah during the day, and they did that for 12 months. They went on. So that was a gradual first 30 days of intense, and then 1 year of less intense mourning. Dashkabte de Rabbi nafka bat kalava amra kol dehava beashkabte de Rabbi mezumanu lecheolam haba. So on that day that of the funeral of Yeudah Nasi, a divine voice came out, a divine echo, and said, anyone who was at the funeral of Rabbi and showed him honor is invited to come to the world. Is invited to the world to come. Because by even showing honor to a great sage, that itself is an amazing, a wonderful deed worthy of Olam Haba. Now, Hahu Kobes, there was a launderer, who usually is a simple, probably not a learned person. This launderer would come to the Yeudah Nasi every day and visit him and give him honor. He was a devoted follower of the Yeudah Nasi every day, except that day of the funeral. He didn't come. For whatever reason, he wasn't able to come. When he heard this bat call, he was so upset that every day I went to visit him. This one day that I could have gone to Olam Haba, I missed that day. He was so upset. He went up to the roof and he fell off and he died. He committed suicide. The divine echo said that launderer also is destined for the world to come. This is a very interesting and important story, because in general, suicide is prohibited, and if one Barmenan commits suicide, there's all kinds of laws that they can't be eulogized, they can't be buried in the same place as others. But nowadays, psychological insight says most of the time, maybe all the time, if someone does do such an act, it means because they are in great sorrow, they're out of their mind, they're not acting insanity and rationally, and therefore they should not be held accountable and punished for their actions. And so this story here actually would be a good source to support the idea that even if one commits suicide, if they do so out of this kind of great anguish, then they do not deserve that kind of punishment that normally this sin would deserve. Okay, Shimon beni Chacham, Maika Amar. Hachika Amar, Afapisha Shimon beni Chacham, Gamliel beni Nasi. So he says Shimon will be the Chacham. So why is he saying this? What he means is that even though Shimon is Chacham, Gamliel is a Nasi. So he was contrasting the two. Why did he say Shimon beni is a Chacham? Okay, he's a Chacham, right? No, he wants to say Shimon, I want to be clear, is not going to be the Nasi. Gamliel will be the Nasi. Now, Amar Levi, Siricha leMeimar, the idea is that Shimon seems to have been more well-read, and nevertheless, Gamliel is going to be the Nasi. Amar Levi, Siricha leMeimar, Levi says, does he even need to say that? Gamliel, after all, is the oldest, and so the oldest is going to be the Nasi, naturally. Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi, Siricha lach ulemit la'atach, Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi responds sharply to Levi. He says, who needs you and your limp? Levi had a limp. And so he's kind of making fun of him and saying, what are you doing asking questions about Rabbi Yeudah Ha-Nasi? Like, why Rabbi Yeudah Ha-Nasi? You have to say this. Even if he didn't say that Gamliel's a Nasi, would have been the Nasi because he's the oldest. So Rabbi Shimon is challenging Levi. Now we come and say, why is Rabbi, what's Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi's problem? Levi is asking actually a good question. Hakera ka'amar. Pasuk says that Yehoshaphat, after he died, he gave the kingdom over to Yehoram because he was the firstborn. So you see, the firstborn gets the kingship, and the Nasi is kind of like a king. He's the political authority of the Jewish people in Israel. And so it actually makes very, very much sense that they would automatically go to the firstborn. So we actually support Levi's question. So we explain. So the idea is the reason why the Yeudah Ha-Nasi had to say something is because Gamliel because here in this source, Yehoram was worthy of filling his father's place. So that automatically went to him. But Rabban Gamliel was not worthy of filling his father's place. He was great, but not as great as his father. And so therefore, one might have in fact thought that maybe he shouldn't be the next one. And that's why he had to say. So that's why Rabbi Shimon was challenging Levi, right? Levi, don't question Rabbi Yeudah Ha-Nasi. He had a very good reason. It's not necessarily an automatic that's going to go from father to the firstborn son. If the firstborn son's not worthy, then it won't go to him. Okay, so now we ask, well, in fact, if the Gamliel was not worthy, why did he become the Nasi? So why did he appoint his firstborn? It's true that he did not, he was not as fitting as his fathers in wisdom and knowledge, but in fear of sin, he did fill the place of his fathers. And so this is an important lesson that Yirat Chet is the number one criteria, even more than Chokhmah. Okay, next, Hanina bar Chama Yeshev Barosh. Yeudah Ha-Nasi says that Hanina bar Chama is going to be the Rosh Yeshiva. Now, the story goes on. Lo kibel Rabbi Hanina Rabbi Afes Gadom Venu Shete Shanim Umechasa. Even though Rabbi Yeudah Ha-Nasi appointed Hanina bar Chama, Hanina did not accept the position because there was another sage, Rabbi Afes, who was older than him by 2.5 years, and so he should get it first. So sure enough, Yateb Rabbi Afes Beresha, Rabbi Afes became the Rosh Yeshiva first, and after a while he died. Viteb Rabbi Hanina Batrai, and then Rabbi Hanina did in fact become Rosh Yeshiva. Vatelevi Viteb Gabeh. Now, in the meantime, when Rabbi Afes was the Rosh Yeshiva, okay, Hanina is not going to be Rosh Yeshiva, but he's also not going to sit as a student of Rabbi Afes. They're almost colleagues, so he's not going to sit in the classroom. So instead, Rabbi Hanina was sitting outside, learning on his own. Levi, who was also an advanced sage, sat outside, and they studied together, Levi and Rabbi Hanina, while Rabbi Afes was the Rosh Yeshiva. Now later, Nachnaf shed Rabbi Afes, Vitev Rabbi Hanina Beresha. Once Rabbi Afes died, then Rabbi Hanina became the Rosh Yeshiva. Now Levi is not going to be the student of Hanina, so he's not going to enter the classroom, and there was no one else for him to study outside with. He needs a chavruta, and so he left Israel and he went to Bavel to go and study there. And this explains the story that was told to Rav. There's a great person coming to Nehar De'ah, and he's limping. They didn't tell him who it was, but they gave him a hint. Number one, he's limping. And furthermore, he says that wearing a tiara for a woman is permitted on Shabbat. It's not considered carrying. Often, if you wear fancy some jewelry, we worry that the person is going to take off the jewelry in the public domain to show off their friend. But who wears a tiara? Only very important women, and very important women are not going to take it off to show their friend. because they don't need to impress anyone. And so therefore, it's permitted for a woman to wear a tiara on Shabbat in the public domain. This is the halacha that Levi brought with him. Okay, Rav heard that, and just based on those two hints, Amar Shemamina Nach Nafshe de Rabbi Afes. He says, oh, now if Levi's coming here, I can infer, like a Talmudic sugya, he can figure out what happened. It must be that Rabbi Afes died. And now Rabbi Chana became the Rosh Yeshiva. And now Levi had no chavruta outside, and so that's why he came. Right? Rav understood all of the relations going on, and immediately put all this together. Okay, so now we ask, hold on, how did he know that Rabbi Afes is the one that died? Maybe Rabbi Chanina died. And Rabbi Afes remained Rosh Yeshiva. And the problem is that Rabbi Afes is the Rosh Yeshiva. Now outside, Rabbi Chanina died. Now Levi has no chavruta. How do you know that Rabbi Afes is the one that died and that Rabbi Chanina became Rosh Yeshiva? Vekata, maybe it became because he lost his chavruta, not because Rabbi Afes died. We have a couple of ways that Rav could have known this. Levi Rabbi Afes mekaf hava kayef le. Number one, it could be that Levi was in fact subordinate to Rabbi Afes. And so, if Rabbi Chanina is the one that had died, then Levi would have went inside and been stood at the feet and learn from Rabbi Afes. The only reason he was outside is to keep Rabbi Chanina company, but he wouldn't, if he would otherwise have studied under Rabbi Afes and not come to Bavel. That's one way he could have known. Or because he knew that Rabbi predicted that Chanina would be the Rosh Yeshiva, so it's impossible that he would not become Rosh Yeshiva. It can't be that only Rabbi Afes would be Rosh Yeshiva and Rabbi Chanina would die while Rabbi Afes is the Rosh Yeshiva and never get a chance, since it says regarding righteous that you decree a thing and it is established by you. In other words, once a righteous person says something, it will be established, it will come true. If not now, then eventually. So that's how Rav knew that it must be Rabbi Afes died and Rabbi Chanina did in fact become Rosh Yeshiva. Rabbi Chaya, another question. Wasn't Rabbi Chaya around at the time? How come the Rabbi Chaya wasn't? How come Rabbi Ha-Nasi didn't appoint Rabbi Chaya? He was certainly greater than everyone. The answer is Nach Nafshi he had already died before Rabbi Ha-Nasi died. Wait a second, but didn't Rabbi Chaya once say, I saw the graveside of Rabbi Ha-Nasi and I cried over it? No, it must be the opposite. It was Rabbi Ha-Nasi who said, I saw the grave of Rabbi Chaya and cried over him. Hold on, didn't Rabbi Chaya once say that the day that Rabbi Ha-Nasi died, Kedusha stopped? No, it was the opposite. Rabbi Yeudah said that about Rabbi Chaya. Next, we have another challenge to the idea that Rabbi Chaya died before Rabbi Ha-Nasi. V'atanya keshechala Rabbi nichnas Rabbi Chaya eslo umsao shehu boche. When Rabbi was sick on his deathbed, Rabbi Chaya came to visit him. So that shows that Rabbi was about to die and Rabbi Chaya was just fine. But we're going to quote the whole baraita. So he saw Rabbi Ha-Nasi was crying. Amar lo Rabbi mipnei mata boche. Rabbi Chaya says, why are you crying? V'atanya, and he quotes a baraita, met mitoch hasechok siman yafelo, mitoch habechi siman ralo. If someone dies while laughing, that's a good sign. While crying, that's a bad sign. So you shouldn't be crying. Other signs, panav lemala siman yafelo, panav lemata siman ralo. If his face is up, that's a good sign. Face is down, that's a bad sign. Kepav kelape am siman yafelo, kepav kelape kotel siman ralo. If he's facing the people, that's a good sign. If he's facing a wall, that's a bad sign when he dies. Panav Yerukin siman ra'lo, panav subin v'adumim siman yafe lo. If he's greenish and pale, it's a bad sign. If he's yellow or ruddy, then that's a good sign. Met be'erev Shabbat siman yafe lo, b'moseh Shabbat siman ra'lo. If someone dies on Erev Shabbat, Friday afternoon, Friday night, that's a good sign. But on Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, that's a bad sign. If someone dies before Yom Kippur, that's a bad sign. However, after Yom Kippur, that is a good sign. If someone dies of intestinal problems, that is a good sign, because in fact most righteous people die of intestinal disease. Maybe because it allows they can continue learning Torah even with that disease. It doesn't disfigure their outside body, so that's a better form of disease to die from. Okay, anyway, the point is that it was Rabbi Chaya that came to visit Rabbi when Rabbi was dying. Anyway, the answer, Amar le ana Torah misvot kabachena. Rabbi Yeudah, answer is that, I'm crying because of Torah and mitzvot that I won't be able to fulfill. I love learning Torah, I love doing mitzvot, and after I die, I won't be able to do that. Even though we did see before that he would come visit his house on Erev Shabbat, but he still, even though he visited, he was not able to receive, perform the mitzvot. Okay, so we have a couple of answers. Maybe we have the order of people wrong. It was not Rabbi Chaya that visited Rabbi, but rather Rabbi Chaya was on his deathbed and Rabbi came to visit him. And this conversation just reversed everything, and so in fact it was Rabbi Chaya that died first. Or maybe we can give a new answer. So all three challenges we just had, and each one we switched it around. You don't have to switch any of them around. Leave all of them in the same direction. And in fact, Rabbi Chaya was alive when Rabbi Yeudah Nasi died, and so Rabbi could theoretically have chosen Rabbi Chaya to be the next Rosh Yeshiva, but Rabbi decided not to because Rabbi Chaya was involved in very important mitzvot, as we're going to see in a second, and so Rabbi said, I don't want to hold him back from performing mitzvot. If I appoint him to be the Nasi, then the Rosh Yeshiva rather, then he's going to be involved in running the yeshiva, and he won't do all the good deeds that he's involved in now. So even though Rabbi Chaya was in fact greater than anybody and deserved it the most, Rabbi did not appoint him so he could continue to do mitzvot. And we see the fact that Rabbi Chaya did so many mitzvot from the following argument between Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Chaya. One time they were arguing about some halachic matter, and Rabbi Chanina said, Are you arguing with me? Don't you know who I am? I am so great that if the whole Torah would be forgotten from the people of Israel, I could figure it out on my own through analysis and derive all the halachot, everything that has been lost. All right, I know everything so well that even if you forget a whole bunch of things, I could figure out what it is. And so you should not be arguing with me. I know better what I'm talking about. But Rabbi Chaya responded, I'm doing something better. I'm doing work to make sure that it won't be forgotten in the first place. Right? What's better? For it not to be forgotten in the first place, or let it be forgotten but then restore it? No, what I'm doing is more important. How is he making sure that Torah will not be forgotten? First of all, I go bring flax. I plant it. I grow it. I weave nets, and I make nets out of the flax. Then I go and trap deer. I kill the deer and I feed the meat, which is kosher, to orphans. All that he does actually to get the skin of the deer, and he goes and he makes scrolls from the skins of the deer. But on the way, he also does a mitzvah of helping the poor. And then I go to a town. I go from town to town all over the place. I go to a place that has no teacher for children, and so the kids don't know anything. And I write each of the 5 books of the Torah for 5 children. I give it to them. I said, here, study this. And then I go in that also town. I get 6 kids that are sharp, good memory, and I teach each one of the 6 one of the sedarim of Mishnah. And to each one I say, go and teach the Mishnah to your friend. The Mishnah would be learned by heart. And so you see, to be Chiyah, what he would do to make sure Torah would not be forgotten, he would go and make scrolls so we could write Torah, go from town to town, give them a copy of the Torah, teach them the Mishnah by heart, so that these kids then would grow up and they would be the teachers. And now you have a learned community. Rabbi said, how great are the works of Rabbi Chiyah, and so that's why that work was more important than Rabbi Chiyah becoming the Rosh Yeshiva. Amar le Rabbi Shimon ben Rabbi, afilu mimmecha. Rabbi Shimon asked Rabbi, is his work even greater than your work? That you're a Nasi? Amar le'in, yes. Right, going and making sure that there are schools in different towns and people that are knowledgeable to teach. That's even more important than being the Nasi. Amar le Rabbi Ishmael ben Rabbi Yoseh, afilu me'abba. Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Yoseh, asked him, is Rabbi Chiyah's work even greater than my father? His work, Rabbi Yoseh, Amar le Chas v'Shalom. Rabbi Chiyah said, no, we're not going to say such a thing. Lo teheh kazot b'Yisrael. We should not say such a thing. Right? We're not here to put down the previous generations like Rabbi Yoseh. But if we're talking about people around now, who's doing the most important job? It's Rabbi Chiyah, over and above the Nasi, over and above the Rosh Yeshiva. So this is really a beautiful Agadah, talking about the importance of elementary education. Amar lehen, libni katana nisarich. Okay, now Rabbi Yeudah Nasi, back to his deathbed, he's calling in different people, and now he calls his youngest son. Nichnas Rabbi Shimon eslo, masalo sidre chochma. So Shimon is going to be the chacham, which actually sounds like it's some kind of official position, and so he gave him the wisdom of how one should conduct himself as the chochma, as a chacham. Amar lehen, libni gadol nisarich. Then he calls in his eldest son, who's going to be the Nasi. Nichnas Rabban Gamliel etzlo, masa lo sidre nesiut, and he teaches him, here's how you should be the patriarch. Amar lo, beni nehog nesiutcha beramim uzrok mara betalmidim. Says when you're Nasi, you should be assertive. Ram, you should hold yourself high above others and put fear in your students. So you have to be very firm and and instill awe in others. We have a question. No, but in Tehillim it says even a king honors those who fear God. In other words, even the Nasi should give honor to others, to people who fear Hashem. And so this applies to Yehoshaphat, the king, a good king, that when he saw a sage, he would stand up from his throne and hug and kiss the sage and say, my teacher, right? My master. So you see that even a king should show deference and honor to a Talmid Chacham. And so the same thing here, there shouldn't a Nasi show deference and not be assertive and have fear over students? And the answer is La kashaha b'sinaha b'farhesya. It depends. If they're in private, then the Nasi, the king, should give honor to the student. But in public, you have to make sure that the Nasi's authority is well known, and so he should not say those things in public. Okay, Tanya, Rabbi mutal besipori makom muchan lo bebet she'arim. Now Rabbi is actually gonna die. The problem is he was lying in Sipori. That's where he was on his deathbed. But his place of burial was in Bet She'arim. See, here is Sipori, and here is Bet She'arim. So they're going to have to transfer him there. Wait a second. V'hatanya sedek tidof alecha achar Rabbi lebet she'arim. We have another midrash that says you should always pursue justice, and that means physically go and run to the highest court that's around. And during the time of Rabbi, that was in Bet She'arim. So really, Rabbi should have been sitting in Bet She'arim. What was he doing in Sipori? Why was his deathbed in Sipori? The answer is Rabbi bebet She'arim ava ela kevan de lachash Teyuhi Lesipori. In fact, he did live in Bet Sharim. That's where he lived. That's where he worked. That's where his Bet Din was. But when he became halash, when he became sick, they brought him to Sipori, Demi Dalia Ubesis Avira, because it's on a high altitude and the air is very good there, and so to try to get better, they brought him to Sipori. All right, there's a little bit more about the death of Rabbi on the next daf. Baruch Adonai L'olam, Amen v'Amen.